Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon and welcome, everybody. And welcome to British Antarctic Survey. My name is Martin Collins and I'm going to be doing some introductions of the speakers this afternoon. So welcome to this commemoration and celebration of the life of Bob Burton. A particularly warm welcome, I think, to Jackie and Bob's family. Welcome to British Antarctic Survey, and really good to see, so many old friends and familiar faces in the room today. So welcome, Jackie. I'm just going to do the introductions. I work here at British Antarctic Survey, so I will just talk you through what we'll do today, and I will introduce the various speakers we have for you this afternoon. The way we're going to do this today, we'll be in this room for around about an hour. We've got a series of short reminiscences of Bob's life and some highlights and from a few old friends and colleagues of Bob's, and then there will be food served outside afterwards. You've probably found them already, but if any of you need the bathrooms, the gents are just outside down to the right down there, and the ladies across the hall over there. If the fire alarm were to go off, it won't be a test, it'll be the real thing. I'm pretty sure it won't, but just in case, please just retrace your steps to reception, and I will be there, and there's other members of the BAS staff here who will be able to guide you as well, but I'm sure that won't happen. Anyway, I'm just before starting, I'd just like to thank a few people. Jackie has asked me particularly to thank British Antarctic Survey, of course, Jane Francis, Julie Leyland, and Josh, who's been helping me with the IT today, for making this all happen and allowing the facilities here to be used today. So thanks to BAS and all involved in that. I've just turned up on the day to be the front man for this. There's been, as you can see, an awful lot of work has gone on in the background by a large number of people. I will mention, Jackie, of course, has been involved, but Bruce Pearson, Fran Prince, Pat Lurcock has actually done a fantastic job of putting all this together. Sadly, Pat and Sarah can't be here today, but this is being streamed live, as you probably know, so Pat will be watching like a hawk and making sure everything runs smoothly, and he's got my WhatsApp number there to tell me if I go too far astray. So hopefully I'll keep things on the straight and narrow anyway. As you'll see, we've got a series of images of Bob's time, a lot of it of his time down south. I will transfer that in a second, and we'll have a series of speakers come up and give some presentations. I was trying to work out this morning quite how long I've known Bob, actually, and I don't really know. I've just seemed to have known him an awful long time. I must have come across Bob when I first joined BAS in 2002, and he's been an enormous fount of knowledge, for me anyway, on all things South Georgia. Incredibly helpful. During my time at South Georgia Government, Bob was the go-to man for me to ask any questions, and I always turned to Bob for things about South Georgia, and he wrote the Visitor's Guide for South Georgia Government as well at that time. And then Bob persuaded me, perhaps a little bit reluctantly, to take over editing the South Georgia Association newsletter from him a few years ago. And of course Bob was a really hard act to follow. I've tried my best to follow in his footsteps. And Bob actually carried on proofreading the newsletter for me each time. I was very good at finding the little faults that had slipped through. He always corrected me for not putting enough history in the newsletter and putting too much science, because I'm a scientist, of course. But anyway, it's great to be here today, and it's a real privilege for me to be asked to introduce this today. So thanks to all those who've been involved in the planning and organising of this. And there are some, as you see, some fabulous images of Bob that will keep popping up. Now, it seems a shame to turn that off, but I will have to do that, I'm afraid. And we will put this back on at the end, and I will actually ask everyone to gather once we've had the speeches and the talks for a photograph at the front here, once we've done all that. So I will now, I'm afraid, turn this one off temporarily. And, well, actually, the first one you've got is me, so I've done my introduction already. So Pat has arranged all this. Now, some of our speakers today have pre-recorded their messages because they can't be here in person, sadly. But quite a few of them will be here in person. And I have actually been asked to read out a message from Dick Quinnell, who sadly can't be here today, and struggled with the recording of his message, so I will read that one out a little bit later. Anyway, the first message we have today comes from Tony and Rosemary Booth, and this has been recorded.
So hello, Jackie, your family, and friends and colleagues of Bob. My name's Tony, and this is my wife, Rosemary. Tony and Rosemary Booth. We, at the moment, we're living on Vancouver Island, just off the Pacific coast, and it's pouring with rain. We've been talking so much about Bob because Bob grew up with us and we grew up with Bob. We lived in Horsley, and we played together in what, looking back at it, was a real paradise. We had a 30-acre wood with a stream that you could drink out of, eat the watercress. There was no adults there. It was just absolutely heaven. Rather like A.A. Milne's Winnie the Pooh, 30 acres there. Bob sort of joined us sort of strangely. We used to play with the kids there, and all of a sudden Bob was with us. I'm not quite sure really who was the ringleader of our group. I think it probably alternated, but we had those long summer holidays in the mid-1950s where everything was on the up and things couldn't be better. So we never got bored, but we always had something to do. And I'd like to just mention a few things that Bob and I got up to. We like the natural sciences together, but I like chemistry. And to me, that was things that went bang. And that was quite easy after the war because there was access to explosives, quite honestly. Can't really say too much about it, but we had access to naval cordite. And, you know, so on occasion we went to the cinema, and one occasion we saw cavaliers shooting muskets and blunderbusses at each other. So what better thing to do than make blunderbusses, and which we did, and we lived through it. And
well, mind you, I had to bring my first aid kit many a time. You had to patch them up.
Yeah, singes, ringing ears, burns, cuts. Other things like we built a ramjet out of baked bean tins and used a pressured insecticide spray to spray paraffin into it. Almost burnt my father's garage down because it melted. The highlight, I think, was nitrogen triiodide, which exploded with a purple smoke. And anyway, Bob and I used to get up to these things. On one occasion, he wasn't there, and I experimented with the nitrogen triiodide, got a rash on my arm, so I went to the doctor. He took one look and he said to me, he said, "You haven't been playing with the Burton boy, have you?" Because Bob actually had a rash as well from too much iodine. And of course, I was persona non grata after that. I use the word loosely grew up, but we did grow up together. Bob helped me with my car, which eventually he bought from me for a trumpet and 20 pounds, I think it was.
And its name?
I think he got the better deal there.
Name was Bumble.
Bumble, good old Bumble.
Yeah.
Bob was actually witnessed my first driving accident from the passenger seat. Yeah, but we were both watching a very attractive young girl on the sidewalk, smiling at us, we thought, but she wasn't really smiling at us. She could see what was going to happen because the traffic stopped in front and we were too busy looking at her. Yeah, bruised egos there. Later on...
what happened to Bumble?
Bumble ended up as a garden tractor in Western House in Albury. And
yes.
thanks to Jackie, we've got some great photos of
Yes,
other
they're
families
lovely.
enjoying it. Okay, we started growing up. Bob went to Cambridge, university came to me, London. Chemistry went to chemical engineering. And we seemed to sort of grow apart for a little bit. But Bob, when he went on the first British Antarctic expedition, as I call it, he came to dinner with us. We were married at the time. On his last night.
Yeah.
And we didn't see Bob, I think, for about 2 or 3 years then. In the meantime, we had moved to Holland and we travelled around, but we always kept contact with Bob. We always did.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing when I say we grew up together, every time we spoke, we never really spoke politics or anything like that. We just spoke about our childhood together and all those adventures.
Such happy memories.
And to be quite honest, that's a big miss with us.
Yeah.
We always reverted to that.
Yeah.
And Robert was always Bob to us, always. He was a wonderful young boy of our childhood.
He was always happy and smiling.
He really was.
Yeah,
he really was.
It was lovely to know. Yeah.
Thank you.
We're very, very sad.
Yes, we are.
And our condolences to Jackie and the family.
Yes.
And all friends. Yeah.
And thank you, Bob.
Thank you, Bob.
Bye-bye, all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Well, thanks very much to Tony and Rosemary Booth there with some fabulous memories from Bob's childhood times. Next, I would like to invite Mark Taylor to come and say a few words. Mark is Bob's nephew, and he's going to say a few words.
Hi. Those of you well acquainted with Bob will probably know that he was a very good public speaker. And unfortunately, I don't think too much of that skill has filtered its way along the branches of the Burton family tree as far as me, but I will do my best. One thing that has filtered along the branches of the family tree, as far as me and in fact beyond to my daughter, is some sort of ability to make a very logical but entirely misguided assessment of a situation. For example, when she was about 5 and faced with a long car journey on which there was something of a petrol shortage and we weren't sure we would get there, she sat silent for a while and then announced, "I know, if we drive really fast, we can get there before we run out." And it was a similar sort of misguided logic that Bob once applied when he was about 5, as related to me by my mother, who was his older sister. They were all sat round the dinner table, and Bob turned to his grandmother and said, "So, Granny, what were the dinosaurs like? Were they really, really big?" Now, when I was 5, we moved to Kenya for 18 months due to my dad's work. And Bob came out and joined us for a few weeks' holiday. And the first thing we did was to take him to Nairobi National Park. Now, in those days, and maybe still today, the park entrance fee for tourists was twice what it was for local residents. And us all being local residents, we thought, "Oh, we'll sneak Bob in with us as a local resident." But the guy on the gate took one look at Bob's pasty white, fresh out of England legs sticking out of shorts and said, "He's not a Kenya citizen." And that was the end of that economy plan. And then a bit later, Dad took Bob out on a sort of bird spotting field trip with another guy driving a Land Rover, and they drove up to the north end of Lake Hannington. And there they found that the lake was completely dried up, a flat expanse of dry, cracked up mud. And they thought, "Oh, we'll take a shortcut across there." And so they drove across, and they'd almost reached the other side when the Land Rover suddenly just went up to its axles in thick, gooey mud, stuck. Now, I actually have a picture of this somewhere. Because Bob got out, and he started a very logical but entirely misguided attempt to dig the Land Rover out. As seen, well,
Sorry,
no.
that doesn't seem to be...
Oh, it's not an option, sorry. But anyway, I thought I had a picture of him trying to dig the Land Rover out, which was up to its axles in this mud. And while all this was going on, a local sort of tribesman just appeared as if from nowhere and watched them for a while before disappearing again without a word. And they gave him no more thought until quite some time later he reappeared with most of his entire tribe, and together they managed to pull the Land Rover out. And had they not done so, that Land Rover would probably still be there now. Now, up until I was aged 12, we lived with my grandparents, who were, of course, also Bob's parents. And he was a frequent visitor to the house. And he often seemed to appear from nowhere and just stick his head round the door to announce his presence. And when asked what he was up to, he would very often glibly say something like, "Oh, I'm just on my way to Antarctica," or Greenland, or somewhere interesting like that. And so it was that I came to refer to him as my uncle, the Antarctic explorer. He was a very lovely man, and very helpful and very generous, and very interesting, of course. And he was not only a very good public speaker, but he was also an extremely talented writer. And he wrote many books and articles in his time, my favourite of which is a book called The Bird Feeder Handbook, which was something of a collaboration between both my parents, particularly my father, who supplied most of the photographs to illustrate the book. And it was also a very popular book, selling in excess of 1 million copies. Now, probably the last time I spent much time with Bob was when he got me my own trip to Antarctica aboard one of the cruise ships on which he was a guest speaker. And it was really exciting to actually see Antarctica for myself, and also to spend some time with Bob. And I also very much enjoyed his talks, which were mostly about natural history and also the history of the exploration of Antarctica and South Georgia. But one I particularly remember was about scurvy and its effects on naval exploration and nautical pursuits. And he listed some of the symptoms of scurvy, including the lesser-known fact that if you have scurvy and you have some scar tissue, that scar tissue is likely to maybe sort of weaken and disintegrate. And he ended the talk by saying, "I've been bitten and scratched by various animals. I've had serious accidents, and I've had a hip operation. If I got scurvy, I'd literally fall out of myself." And as the laughter and applause died away, I heard a guy next to me turn to his friend and say, "Great talk. I just love his dry, quintessentially English humour." And it was all I could do to stop myself turning to him and proudly saying, "He's my uncle, you know." And so I invite you to raise your glasses to my Uncle Robert, the Antarctic explorer, Bob Burton.
Thank you very much, Mark, and apologies we didn't have the picture of the vehicle there to be dug out, but I think it may be one of the ones that's shown on the sequence later. Yes, exactly. The next is actually some words that have come from Dick Quinnell. Dick was at Cambridge with Bob, and Dick can't be here today. So I've agreed to read out what Dick had to say, which I will do my best to do justice to. So first of all, Jackie and everyone, so sorry that Pauline and I can't be with you in person, but we are in spirit, and that's from Dick. And his contribution is entitled, "My contribution in celebration of Bob is called Cambridge, Friendship and Loch Ness." I met Bob at Cambridge in 1960. we were both enrolled on the main zoology module of the wonderful natural sciences Tripos, and I think also both on the medical physiology module. We quickly established that we shared a sense of humour, a love of natural history, and a thirst for good draft beer. And each morning after the first lectures at 10:30, we would repair to the Bun Shop, a rather forlorn pub embedded in the lab district, for a pint, in the company only of a sad and lonely bunch of alcoholic lecturers desperate for their maintenance fix of scotch. At lunchtime, we would repair to the Horse and Groom in King Street, frequented by a convivial bunch, mainly from Jesus College, led by Martin Marix Evans, for a fry-up lunch and, certainly in my case, 4 to 5 pints of Green King Abbot Ale. The afternoon dissection and practical histology sessions were, not surprisingly, honoured in the breach rather than the observance. Instead, afternoons would be spent lounging in someone's rooms, listening to music, discussing burning issues of history, literature, philosophy, science, art, religion, and ethics, and generally acquiring a liberal education. I also played and sang all kinds of folk music, and Bob played rugby. In 1961, Bob's father, Dr. Maurice Burton, a very distinguished zoologist and popularising naturalist who had flirted briefly with the plesiosaur explanation of the Loch Ness Monster mystery, came to his senses and published a book, The Elusive Monster, debunking the wild plesiosaur elasmosaur claims. However, at the same time, another book, The Loch Ness Monster, was published by Tim Dinsdale, an amateur monster hunter, with photographs and a film made by Dinsdale showing what he claimed to be a large plesiosaur-like animal that he had observed at close quarters. To demolish Dinsdale's claims, Morris needed a film of phenomena like standing waves, floating logs, etc., that looked similar to the monster films, could be shown to be inanimate. And as I had met Morris as a friend of Bob's and had transport, Bob and I were dispatched on a not monster hunting expedition to Loch Ness. In my minivan, armed with an Olympus 16mm cine camera and wide-angled and telephoto lenses, for 2 weeks at the very comfortable Foyers Hotel overlooking the loch, all expenses paid. We interpreted this to include all the whiskey we cared to drink. We took some great film of convincing but provably inanimate non-monsters like floating logs, standing waves and extraordinary ripple patterns around submerged shingle banks, and were able to prove that from stated times and dates, locations, lighting, water depth and evidence left on the ground, Dinsdale had faked his photographs. Bob was extremely good company on that trip, probably the first of his many scientific expeditions. I realised by my second year that I would make a lousy scientist, but had a wonderful time learning about human biology, the human body, extraordinarily diverse zoological topics, and an unforgettable year doing experimental psychology with the great Richard Gregory, and making music with other friends I've kept to this day. Bob played rugby and broke his leg. Cooped up in his room, very bad-tempered at forced inactivity, and in some student squalor, he received, I'm afraid, too few visits from his friends. We called it the polecat's lair. Most of our zoology year got firsts or 2 degrees in 1963. Only Alan Roberts and I got 2 2s, a gentleman's degree. Alan went on to become Professor of Zoology at Bristol University, so I wasn't in too bad company. But I became an artist blacksmith. Bob got a 3rd. His interview with his father must have been dreadful. As a terrible penance, he exiled himself to Antarctica, not even as a zoologist, but as a meteorological technician. The rest is history, and I leave it to others who know much more about it to relate his redemption in Antarctica and his triumphant subsequent career. I feel privileged to have been his friend. Well, I thought that was a wonderful message from Dick, and a great tribute to Bob. And I suspect Dick is amongst the many who are actually watching this live streamed on YouTube this afternoon. So next I would like to invite Inigo Everson to take the stand and tell us a little bit about his reminiscences of Bob.
Have I got a picture?
You have got a picture, Inigo, yes. How was that?
A lot better, I think. Ah, yes. Please excuse me reading. I'm getting old and my memory is extremely poor. So I thought I'd write it down and I'd read it all to you. And in fact, having heard Dick Quinnell's version of Bob at university, it's quite different to the impression that I'd gained when I knew Bob. Anyway, to start off with, to get back to my involvement with Bob, many of you will have sat examinations. Most of you, hopefully, will have passed and received a certificate indicating you knew a lot about your subject. You might have concluded from that that you understood your subject. That was me in 1964 with a degree that included classical zoology, just like you've heard with Robert. How much of my subject did I know and understand? In December, I arrived on Sydney and met Bob. His face looked familiar. Interestingly, it was not long before I felt I'd known him for years. As a result, as I listened to him, I realised that classical zoology had largely involved things like dry bones, dead animals, all their bits in bottles preserved. Bob, however, equated classical zoology with natural history. He admired Konrad Lorenz and Nico Tinbergen, authors of these two books here. And I once jokingly called him Tin Burton. Thankfully, he felt flattered. Behind all this was his perceived need for us to use our senses, particularly sight, sound, touch, and perhaps smell, to give the subject breadth. Not only that, he didn't so much as teach, but offered information that might be worth pursuing. In short, Bob was a guide opening up my mind in the true scientific sense. On his return home in 1966, in collaboration with his father, Dr. Maurice Burton, he wrote a part work for the publisher Purnell, his A to Z Encyclopedia of Animal Life. It's one of the books that I don't see on the desk out there, mainly because I think it'd be too large to bring in, because I think it's 10 volumes, isn't it?
It's falling to bits.
Is it?
It's falling to bits.
Is it? It's because it's so good that it's been read a lot.
I think he's pinched bits from it.
The diversity of subjects, with most of the species described being unknown to me, even by name, it was breathtaking to look through it. In short, Bob added breadth and depth to my knowledge of classical zoology. On top of that, you only have to read Konrad Lorenz, the left-hand book there, to learn that science can be fun. Watching goslings imprint and then leading them in line behind as he swam, it looked odd and even silly, but was scientifically important. So science could be both extremely serious, but also a source of fun. This was probably behind his love of The Goon Show, a radio comedy of the late 1940s and early 50s with Harry Seacombe, Peter Sellers and Spike Milligan. Those three audio clowns took a sideways, bizarre and stupid extrapolation of everyday things. There was the flood that resulted from Queen Anne's reign. What would he have made of a platinum rain? Plutonium? I don't know. New words appeared, such as lurgy and scradge, and others like porridge. They were made to sound somehow funny. Even the concept of a porridge motorbike that appealed to Bob particularly. So on first meeting, why did Bob's face look so familiar? The answer lay in my childhood pocket money, which sometimes contained a penny or two, on which of some of the coins was a familiar face. And this is taken from the private eye version of lookalikes, and you can see here the King George V 1 penny. That was my picture of Bob, a king, a natural history King Bob. A quotation from Konrad Lorenz that could just as easily have come from Bob, and this is from his book up there. The study of animal behaviour demands a great deal of sitting quite still. Some of my more critical friends contend that this is exactly why I have chosen it as a profession. Doesn't sound like Bob really, but never mind. I suppose that there is some truth in this, but of course such work also means writing down what has been done, reading what other naturalists have done, attending conferences, etc. Konrad Lorenz and Bob had very much in common, particularly if you read that book. In particular, they both had humour and, dare I say it, humility. Recently, as we all know, Bob rode away on his Porridge motorbike, but leaves us all with many happy memories. My condolences go to Jackie and the family. I hope that my contribution, along with those of his many friends here, helped you come to terms with your loss. But let me finish on a less sombre note, and a quotation from Peter Sellers, arch goon, who said, "Just remember, there is a time for laughing and a time for not laughing, and this is not one of them." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Inigo. And next I would like to invite Jerry Knights, who's going to tell us something about the Joint Services Expedition. Jerry.
Thank you. Please excuse my short hair. It's got nothing to do with having been in the military. It's just I've never really recovered from having it cut twice by Bob during expeditions. The Telegraph obituary clearly covered the breadth of Bob's endeavours, but there was no mention of his Joint Services expeditions, and it was these that first introduced him to the high Arctic. Bob was a member of 3 such expeditions, each about 4 months long, in tented accommodation, and with scientific rather than adventurous aims. Any member of the military interested in organising such a venture gets minimal support from the public purse. So both academic endorsement and civilian sponsorship are essential for its success. The knowledge of how to secure these was just part of Bob's invaluable contribution. Bob was a huge champion of citizen science, and assisting us enthusiastic amateurs from the military appealed to him. His Arctic expeditioning began when Alan Booth, Royal Navy, who he'd known when they'd both lived on the Scottish west coast, invited the 34-year-old Bob to join the 1977 expedition to Liverpool Land in East Greenland as scientific advisor. The trip was hard, culminating in a walkout at the end of almost 90 miles to Mestersvig, man-packing enormous loads of loaned equipment that had to be returned to stores. Steve Williams' Royal Navy was also on Liverpool Land, and he led the next expedition that Bob joined, and this was to Princess Murray Bay on Ellesmere Island in 1980. And it was during team selection in 1978 that I first met him. At the somewhat daunting interview, he was kind and encouraging, yet insightful. Johnny Torrance Spence, Royal Dragoon Guards, destined to be our botanist, was asked about the preservation of plant specimens. As a company commander in an armoured division, Johnny claimed that he pressed most of his with 56 tons of Chieftain tank. Princess Mary Bay became a PCSP, that's Canadian Polar Continental Shelf Project, sponsored expedition, and its achievements were considered a huge success. Steve, the leader, being awarded the RGS's Ness Award in 1981. Bill Hankinson, Royal Air Force, was a Princess Mary Bay team member, and he once remarked that he'd spent more time sleeping in a tent with Bob than he had with his wife. It was Bill who led the third expedition with me as his deputy and logistician to Borup Fjord, also on Ellesmere Island, in 1988. Once more, Bob stepped up to the challenge. He acted as our mentor as we developed the science programme, as our confidant when we selected team members and allocated them to projects, and he skillfully kept those projects on the rails throughout. The 18 of us were an eclectic mixture of servicemen, women, and civilian scientists, and it proved another success. One member, Henry Parker, Royal Navy, went on to develop his Borup limnological studies in conjunction with a Californian university and was awarded his doctorate for the work. In the early 1990s, Bob, along with Kathleen and Neville Cartwright, led client trips for Angus Erskine's company Arcturus Expeditions, and in 1992 they took it over from Angus. Bob loved the trips, particularly those to East Greenland, but on one occasion he took the novelist Gilly Cooper dog sledding to northern Norway, while she conducted research for a book to be entitled Husky. The project wasn't completed, so we'll never know whether it was a snowy romp with the Chelsea set or a steamy romance with a tall, bearded Arctic explorer. Bob last led ecotourist camping in 2003, although he continued with the company's management until 2006. In summary, Bob provided the same essential bridge between academia and us assorted ologists as he did with the general public through his Daily Telegraph nature notes. All of us from his Arctic expeditions admired his enthusiasm, resourcefulness, formidable knowledge, and his superb ability to communicate it to others. Our lives have been truly richer as a result, and we're all proud to have called him our friend. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jerry. Next, I would like to invite Bjorn Basberg, who will talk a little bit about the heritage and archaeology on South Georgia and Bob's part in that.
I can put on that. Okay, that's fine. With that bottom? Yeah.
Yeah. So one of Bob's numerous talks were titled Shackleton and the Norwegians. And it's tempting to sort of rephrase this title and use it as a headline on my remarks here today into Bob and the Norwegians. So especially from the mid-1990s, when he was the director of the South Georgia Whaling Museum, as it was called at the time, Bob was inevitably involved with the whaling history and the heritage, with his very strong Norwegian connections, of course. And that also led to contact with the ex-whalers, and at that time, almost 30 years ago, many of them were still around. and he made friends with them. He consulted them when he needed to identify the nuts and bolts of the whaling industry, needed a translation of some weird Norwegian whaling expression, or just needed a Norwegian perspective on anything relating South Georgia. But soon he also became the South Georgia expert himself and was ready to assist his Norwegian friends and help them on really any matters relating South Georgia. In 1997, when Bob was still director at the museum, he was appointed an honorary friend, æresvenn, of the association Øyas Venner, the Friends of the Island in Norway, and a project that he was in charge of at the time that had a particular interest in Norway was the restoration of the church in Grytviken. And in a typical Bob approach, he pulled together the efforts of many people and organizations in Norway, and of course also in this country, including his old Antarctic friends that helped him out up on the roof there and on any matters relating the church restoration. So I was fortunate to learn to know Bob during those years when I also worked closely on the industrial heritage at South Georgia. And over the following years, we cooperated on numerous projects. We wrote papers together, and we became friends. And he was always keen to help out in various ways in our work on the industrial archaeology at the island. And he himself later took the lead in extending the scope of South Georgia archaeology into the sealing era archaeology. A joint interest that we obviously shared with many of you here was Shackleton. Bob was, again, the expert on any large, and I should also say very small, aspects of the South Georgia, of Shackleton issues. And at South Georgia, one of our focal points was the Strømnes Villa. And we surveyed, we researched, and we identified once and for all the correct building there. Until then, there had been some confusion about that in some circles, I should say. Some 20 years ago, Bob wrote to me, and I quote, "The good news from Stanley is that they have changed their minds and agreed that the Strømnes Villa can be saved. It seems possible to make it safe for visitors. I don't know who is going to finance it, but I have offered to help raise money," end quote. Well, for those of you who have followed this for some time will know that not so much has really happened and been decided, although money is being raised for the villa as we speak here, among others by a certain swimmer up in the Orkneys, as some of you will know. But during this long process that might end up in something, it was always very vital to have Bob around, because he never forgot what was written, what was said, what was promised 20 or 30 years ago. He became the institutional memory in many ways that was crucial for keeping issues on track at South Georgia. And that related the villa and the Shackleton legacy, but also numerous other matters. I had the privilege to serve on the government, South Georgia government's Heritage Advisory Panel, together with Bob. And a meeting rarely passed without Bob, always soft-spoken and with his typical sense of humor, could educate the panel and put the records straight. So, in addition to very many other things relating the heritage work at South Georgia, this is something we should be extremely thankful for. So, thank you.
Holding. Thank you, Bjorn. And I think Jackie was just highlighting how tense Bob looked in that photograph. Holding on tightly, I think. It's great to see all the different, and I didn't know half of what Bob had done, to be honest, and it's great to find out some of these stories from different parts of his life. Next, we have Sarah Lercock, and Sadly, Sarah and Pat can't be with us here today, so Sarah has recorded her message, which I will play for you now.
Pat and I would have loved to have been there with you all today. We're really sorry that we're not, but I am really grateful to have been asked to talk today. Mainly it's going to be about where our lives have crossed over with Bob's around South Georgia. Although his history with South Georgia extended back to his youth, Bob entered our lives when he arrived back on the island as director of the South Georgia Museum. The museum was in its infancy then, and for several years, Bob negotiated what we came to call the South Atlantic Triangle. It was South Georgia politics between various people in the UK, the Falklands, and South Georgia. It was a time of big ambitions, but small budgets. But Bob had a knack for making things happen, and something he successfully continued to do throughout all the years after. What a difference Bob has made to the recognition of the importance of studying and protecting the history and heritage of South Georgia. He instigated, supported, and often participated in a wide variety of projects, some of which we were involved in. I joined one of Bob's teams as the chef on the church roof restoration project, and Bob directed the cemeteries restoration project that Pat and I did one southern summer down there. Although never strident, Bob also knew how to be heard. This included being a founding member and a long-term newsletter editor of the South Georgia Association. Bob recognised aspects of South Georgia history that were under-regarded, under-researched and under-protected, including the military history and the importance of the rapidly eroding evidence of some of the earliest human activities on the island, the sealing. In recent years, Bob organised the first archaeological survey of sealing and some of the other historical sites around the island. It would be great if, as part of his legacy, this important research can continue. Anytime Bob was on the island, he had a number of things he wanted to find, survey, and research. Once his tenure as South Georgia Museum finished, we were delighted that the South Georgia government agreed to host Bob, with his able assistant Jackie, to conduct research on the beacons erected during Shackleton's Endurance expedition. These markers, which became known as Hudson's beacons, assisted the ships to align their compasses. As we all know, Bob's interests and expertise were not confined to history. He wrote and regularly updated the South Georgia government brochure for visitors. He also worked with and supported the wider work of the South Georgia Heritage Trust, working with them to plug gaps in the accessible information about the island with publications on Shackleton, maritime history, and he wrote the definitive guide to the wildlife. Whilst he was the museum director, Bob forged links with the expeditionary cruise ship industry. Wonderfully, this brought him through the island regularly. He would have plans to spend time around the whaling station, but we would kidnap him and make him come into the museum and sign piles of books to assist with the SGHD fundraising. He didn't complain so long as we plied him with tea and cake at the same time. Bob was an instant ally and friend to all the many museum staff he met over the years. Then later I became the director at the museum, and with the introduction of satellite communications, we quite literally had Bob on speed dial. Any day in the museum office, a conversation would be taking place over Skype chat, Southern Hemisphere to Northern Hemisphere, as we were collaborating on historical and museum projects, or perhaps probed Bob's knowledge or mined his considerable collection of photographs, or sometimes just got him to proofread some of our text. Curatorial interns were told that they must get Bob to check over their exhibition texts. And documents would quickly be returned to us with numerous edits, much improved and much more accurate. In turn, Bob would ask us or Pat to pop out and just photograph this or measure that. As a museum, we wished we could have downloaded Bob, We'd keep his knowledge as a sort of a form of local Wikipedia.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And I know Sarah and Pat are watching from down in Devon and making sure this is broadcast out on YouTube as well. Next, I would like to invite Kim Crosby. Kim's going to say a few words about tourism history and Bob as a polar ambassador. Kim.
Thank you. Oh, there we go. There's a picture. Perfect. Yes, thank you very much for the honour of being able to talk about Bob and his time on the ships in particular and his role as a polar ambassador. There's numerous stories in here that have come from a collection of his shipmates, some of which were sent, and I have to say, I am not saying out loud, but ply me with enough wine, you never know, or Stephanie or Simon or Russ at the back. There's a lot of rather dubious stories. Anyway, I first met Bob in 1991 when I came to the Scott Polar as a little fresh out of my undergraduate degree and all set to start an MPhil and a PhD working in Antarctica. And we were sent down to what became known as the Garden Shed Expedition. And one of the things that we were working on was, we were asked to do, was to collect blood from skuas. And I met Bob over the tea trolley that used to get wheeled out into the museum at the Scott Polar, and he was a constant source of information and advice, not least when we were slightly worried about this programme of collecting blood from skuas and knowing full well what they were capable of. And he was just, it'll be fine. Just wear the colander. You've got a colander with you, haven't you? Just put that on your head. Anyway, he was right, it worked, albeit that the ringing in your ear was something else. But as Sarah's alluded to, in 1993, he was invited to work on board the Ocean Princess by Nigel Sitwell, which, again, many of you will know, as a lecturer. And we were delighted again because it meant he got to come and visit us in Couvreville and bring us chocolate, for which we were eternally grateful. But more importantly, it was the start of a new career for Bob, and one that it's safe to say he was a rip-roaring success at. He loved it. He said the best job was to be the history lecturer, as you just got to sit at the bar and tell ripping yarns, and you didn't really have to bother with going ashore and getting cold and bored, waiting for people to take their pictures of penguins. To say he was a rip-roaring success is an understatement. His knowledge, his understated humour, and his ability to poke fun in a way that never, well, rarely, caused offence, made him a firm favourite both among staff and crew and passengers on board. And by the time I was lucky enough to start to work with him on board the ships, by this point we were working for an American company, Abercrombie and Kent, with principally American passengers. And for Bob, this just was a wide open field to endless sport and entertainment. Mark's mentioned one of the recaps for which he was very famous to do with scurvy. There was another one with the Americans that he always used to trot out, and that was it was about the first sighting of Antarctica, and he would weave this wonderful story about Bellinghausen and Palmer and lull his American audience into this sort of confidence that, it was the Americans first, wasn't it? And then at the very end, he would throw in the fact about William Smith coming there a year earlier, and in fact it was the British, much just to take the wind out of their sails. And in a bid to try and harness his incredible recap skills, because nobody ever wanted to follow him, he was always put on last because he was the finest act. A very cheerful Texan called Carol Walton decided that she was going to harness his abilities and use him, she was an ornithologist, to help teach about penguins, their lifestyle, etc. So she had this inflatable penguin that she blew up, and she pretended to interview it on the stage. But the voice of the penguin was Bob, hidden in the drinks cupboard behind the bar, armed with the gin and tonic. And Carol was very proud of herself because she thought, this is the perfect, he's going to be, he's so full of wonderful information, it'll be great The downside for Carol was that you never knew in which direction Bob was going to take this interview. And it would depend on a large number of factors, not least how cold and bored he'd been that day, or how many stupid questions he'd been asked, or how many gin and tonics he'd had at that point. But it was always entertaining, and everyone would enjoy that. But of course, as we all know, it wasn't just on board that Bob's skill and abilities to communicate, particularly on polar matters, and there's been a lot talked about it today already in terms of his work and efforts. And all of us, I know, in various hats, from the South Georgia Heritage Trust, the South Georgia Association, I used to work for IATO, Bass's Magic Department, a Wyatt UK Antarctic Heritage Trust, we all used to turn to Bob to say, can you help write something or do a lecture or perform and provide additional entertainment? Because you knew you were always going to get something that was original, funny, well-researched, articulate, and just wonderful. And so I think we owe him a huge amount for that. Mind you, he would expect the same for us. And I think if we asked you to put your hands up in this room about how many of you have been asked by Bob of, do you have a slide of ... the tripods or the whatever, this, that, and the next thing. And I'm afraid we would regularly fail him, and the response would be, if I had a $5 for every time somebody's told me they will find their slides that are in their garage, basement, whatever, once they've finished painting the house, retired, etc., he would be a very rich man. But the one that I liked best was Crag Jones, his comment. Crag's a mountaineer, for those of you who don't know, who spent a lot of time in South Georgia, amongst other places. And he commented that it was just amazing. I mean, what he liked most about Bob was Bob's utter bemused indifference to the various mountaineering heroics that they got up to. And he would endlessly pull their legs about these heroic exploits. But as soon as they got home, he would badger them into writing a piece for one of the association newsletters and this, that, next thing. And of course, on the lecture circuit, he was very often paired with the other Bob, good Bob, bad Bob. They were quite a double act. I'll let you decide which was good and which was bad. And one particularly entertaining effort was down in Plymouth when they were marking the centenary of the Endurance setting off on Shackleton's expedition. And both spent most of the time merrily interrupting each other and debating endlessly about what thesis and whether or not Shackleton would have made it had he managed to set foot on the continent. And "Oh, do be quiet" regularly came from good Bob in the direction of bad Bob, and vice versa. And it continued to do so all the way through the pandemic's 1731 electronic Zoom sessions every Friday at 1731, when the most eclectic mix of polar, I don't know what to call you really, characters, that's the safest way, would gather and exchange stories and questions and so on and so forth. So it was right up until the very last minute. Bob was still joining us on the 1731s, and that was very lovely to see. But it was also during the pandemic when Bob was invited to, I think, do a talk for the South Georgia Association, this time with Stephen Venables, about the crossing of South Georgia. And it just struck a number of us during that talk about just how enormous Bob's contribution had been, highlighted through the pandemic when a lot of us were able to go to more things just because they were online and didn't involve travelling. That the idea that really he deserved the recognition of having a place name in Antarctica named after him. He, of course, has one in South Georgia, but it was felt that it was high time he had something in the Antarctic. And a proposal was put forward, and happily, within a matter of weeks, the Antarctic Place Names Committee, without any, I think, question really at all, adopted or approved the naming of the glacier next to Point Wild, the one that in this picture, you can see it overshadows. There's the group of us on shore, the statue of Piloto Pardo, armless and legless, And behind that is the Burton Glacier, as it's now known. And I'm really delighted that I think that was in November 2020, and we were 2021 rather, and Bob was very, very chuffed about that. Not long after that, at New Year, one of the few cruise ships that was able to operate last year, with A&K on board and Bob's old shipmates, they visited Point Wild, and they were able to take a picture and on New Year's Eve send it through to Bob to say, look, here it is, and with a big British flag in front of it, just to, we know who the peninsula belongs to. And so that was a really delightful thing that we were able to send through to him. So a big thank you to Russ, especially, who did the talk at that point and helped send all that information through. But to wrap up, I thought it was best to finish in Bob's own words. And you need a pen and paper because it's a quiz. Bob was less keen as life progressed in the having all these different rules and regulations and having to do, follow rules and regulations, which clearly has been something throughout his entire life, as we've heard. And one of the things he absolutely hated to do was the International Association of Antarctic Tour Operators would do an online assessment for all the field staff. Some of you have had to do it, anyway, and just to prove that you were up to date with all the latest guidelines or whatever going south. Anyway, Bob hated it, and Amanda Linus, who works for IATO, had been busy helping sort him out one time when he'd had problems, technological problems with it, etc. He passed every time with over 90%, and he was reasonably proud afterwards. Anyway, Bob decided to make up his own quiz. And it was questions for senior expedition staff of a limited ability. And you'll be glad to know, I'm not going to ask you all of them, but I will mention just a few. And the first point that you must remember is that you're to answer only one question at a time. Anyway, so here we go. I should have brought my reading glasses. You've been left stranded on an island. What is the best way of getting help? A, scream hysterically into Channel 16. B, sail a small boat to South Georgia. C, set fire to a seal. Oh, yeah, all right. In the middle, there's a few that I am not going to say out loud because they again enter the realms of, really? Well, there's one actually. Here we go. Some of you know the story about one time there was a swimsuit modelling show on board one of these ships, and Bob was very overwhelmed by the sight of apparently I wasn't there of a buxom blonde in a bikini posing in the snow. So one of the questions was, do you react to the sight of a buxom blonde in a bikini posing in the snow with A, shock, B, awe, C, the regret for the loss of youth? Anyway, okay. And so it goes on. In the middle of a recap, you can't remember what comes next. Do you A, joke about needing an auto cue, B, wait for a prompt from colleagues who've heard the story 100 times before, or C, press next and hope for the best? You're asked to write the log. Do you make an excuse that you are A, illiterate, B, illegible, C, illegitimate? Guests are queuing for a lift, the elevator, and your lecture is due to start. Do you run up the stairs and start your presentation out of breath and heart racing, push past the guests explaining that you have work to do, or explain kindly to the guests that using the stairs will make them slimmer and fitter and take the lift? You're asked, is this island surrounded by water? Do you A, laugh uncontrollably, B, demonstrate your superior knowledge of geography, C, check to make sure, D, pretend to be deaf and just shumble off? And finally, lecturing on a cruise ship is better than working for a living. True or false? Anyway, so all of his shipmates and me, we've all lost a great polar ambassador who's contributed a huge amount, and I think we'll only become even more aware of this loss as time goes by. And it's like, where's Bob? Can I ask Bob? But most of all, I think we've lost a really good friend and shipmate. So. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Kim. And that that sort of wraps up the sort of series of talks and presentations that we have planned now. And it has been fantastic to hear the different stories about Bob, and to realise that I only knew sort of one part of Bob, and there were so many different dimensions to Bob's life that I was never aware of, and it's been great to hear all that. So what I propose we do next, I would actually like to get a photograph of everybody together. However, it may not be that sensible to huddle everyone together at the front and do that. So probably what I will do is I will try and elevate myself and take a photograph of the room, and so we can at least get a picture of everybody together. So I'll ask for your patience to remain seated while I do that. Whilst I'm doing that, I will put on the slides of Bob's life that we saw earlier, so you can see them. We will then be going outside for lunch, and I'm sure that'll be a great chance to share some more stories about Bob with each other as we have lunch together. I will leave the slides showing on the screen in this room during that time, so please feel free to wander back in and just sit down and look at those slides, because there really are some fantastic images of Bob and the different aspects of his life. So I will put that on now, and then I will try and find a good place to take a photograph from. I should have brought a wide angle lens. No, I've got a photograph. Yeah. Thank you, everybody, and thank you for your patience. And I've got a photograph of everyone gathered here today, which will be a nice sort of memento of the event, I hope. Thanks for all those fantastic words that have come about Bob. I mean, it's been a pleasure to be able to stand here in front of you and introduce those speakers, and to see some of these images of Bob in his prime, in his pomp. And I would just like to invite you all to move out now to the lobby area where you can have your lunch.